Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're going to be taking a look at Finland's social safety net, and specifically a proposed reform to their Toimeentulotuen system. Now, if you don't speak Finnish, like me, that's basically their last resort financial aid system. We've got three really interesting sources to dig into today. The first one is a firsthand account from somebody who was actually consulted as the government was forming these policies. The second is like a really great FAQ, kind of lays out the reform and all the arguments against it. And then the last one is this analytical brief that I think does a really great job of trying to cut through all the noise and highlight the big picture stuff.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me how Finland, which is often held up as this model for social welfare, is dealing with these really complicated questions about work and welfare and individual responsibility. I think these debates go way beyond just Finland's borders. They really touch on these universal themes that any society with a social safety net has to grapple with.
Absolutely. I mean, even just the name Toimeentulotuen makes me think this is a complex system. So what are we even talking about here?
Yeah, so basically, it's the safety net for people who have exhausted all other forms of financial support. And it's designed to make sure that everybody has like a very basic standard of living. But this proposed reform is looking at changing the eligibility criteria and the benefit levels. And that's what's sparking all of this debate.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty here. Our sources point to this statistic that thousands of Finns are actually on unemployment benefits even though they're not able to work, which seems like, on the surface, a pretty big flaw in the system.
Yeah, you're right. And the source who was consulted during government formation, they really emphasize this point. They're saying that the current system actually incentivizes people to stay on these benefits, even if they can't work, which they argue is not only inhumane, but it's also just economically inefficient. So this raises questions about how Finland assesses somebody's ability to work in the first place. Like, are they too focused on pushing people into any job, even if it's not a good fit for them?
It's almost like the system is trapping people instead of actually helping them, which is like a pretty stark contrast to that image of Finland as like this socially progressive utopia.
Totally agree. And the sources suggest that this reform that's being proposed is aiming to fix this problem by making it harder to qualify for the benefits and encouraging people to go back to work. But critics are saying that this approach, which relies on cutting benefits and imposing all these strict requirements, that it could end up hurting the people who genuinely need this help.
Right. It's that classic carrot and stick dilemma, isn't it? Like, is the government striking the right balance between encouraging people to be self-reliant and providing a safety net for those who really need it?
It's the million-dollar question, right? And the sources are highlighting the need for a more nuanced approach, one that actually understands how complicated people's lives really are, and all the systemic issues that cause unemployment in the first place.
Okay, so the proposed reform is definitely leaning on that stick, cutting benefits, imposing tougher requirements. But what about the carrot? Like, are there any provisions for support or training or resources that will actually help these people find decent jobs?
Well, that's where the critique of this reform gets really interesting. You know, we have this FAQ, and it's laying out the argument that there's a lot of emphasis on pushing people towards work, but they're not actually giving them the tools and support they need to succeed. It's like telling somebody to climb a mountain without giving them any gear.
It's a great analogy. It makes you wonder if this is more about saving money than actually solving the problem. But I do want to play devil's advocate for a second. I mean, there have to be at least some people who are taking advantage of the system, right? Like, is the government wrong to try to crack down on that?
Oh, of course there will always be people who try to game the system. That's true anywhere. But the sources argue that going after this small minority of potential abusers shouldn't come at the expense of those who legitimately need this help. They really emphasize that the vast majority of people who rely on Toimeentulotuen, they're facing real challenges. And these changes could actually push them further into poverty.
So it seems like we're getting into some pretty morally complex territory here. Like, where's the line between personal responsibility and providing support? How do we create a system that encourages people to be self-sufficient without making them feel like they're being blamed for their struggles?
That's the heart of the issue. And honestly, it's a debate that goes way beyond Finland. The sources bring up this tension between individual responsibility and the need for social support. And they really challenge this assumption that people on assistance are lazy or don't want to work.
Yeah, that firsthand account we have is so passionate about this point. They're basically saying that labeling people as lazy or unwilling to work is not only inaccurate, but it's incredibly damaging. And they're really pushing policymakers to look at the bigger picture. The things that actually contribute to unemployment, like a lack of education or geographical limitations or discrimination.
And this connects to a broader trend we see all over the world, right? There's this growing distrust of people who rely on these social safety nets. And that often leads to policies that focus more on punishment than on empowering people to improve their lives.
Okay, so we're starting to see the cracks in the system here and the flaws in these proposed solutions. So what are the sources saying about the real challenges that Finland's facing?
Well, that's where a third source comes in, this analytical brief. It does a really nice job of cutting through all the political rhetoric and just laying out the complex realities of the situation. They point out that Finland, like many developed countries, is facing this thing called a skills mismatch. Basically, there are jobs available, but people don't have the right training or qualifications to fill them.
Right, and it's not as easy as just telling people to move to where the jobs are, is it?
Exactly. You have logistical problems, family ties, all sorts of things that make it really hard or impossible for some people to just pick up and move. This source is saying that the debate is oversimplifying all of these very real complexities and just relying on these punitive measures. It's not going to solve the root causes of the problem.
So it sounds like we're dealing with a system that's incredibly complex and kind of broken in a lot of ways. So where do we go from here? What are our sources saying about possible solution?
Yeah, that's the real core of this whole deep dive, isn't it?
Yeah.
Our sources don't offer like these easy answers, but they're really pushing us to think about what a fair and effective safety net should look like.
Yeah, that's been bouncing around in my head this whole time. What does fair even mean in this situation? I mean, is it about giving everyone a safety net no matter what, even if that means some people might take advantage of it? Or is it about pushing people to work, even if it means some people are going to slip through those cracks?
I think those are the exact questions our sources are struggling with, and they highlight how fairness can be such a subjective idea. You know, the person who was consulted while the government was working on this, they really advocate for a more compassionate approach. They're pushing back against this idea that everyone on assistance is just lazy or doesn't want to work.
Yeah, their perspective is so interesting because they've actually experienced the system firsthand. They talk about how the current system leaves people feeling trapped and hopeless, which seems like the opposite of what a safety net should do.
I agree. And it's not just this one person. All three of our sources say that the current system, even if it comes from a good place, it's failing a lot of people.
So we've got this system that's failing and a proposed reform that doesn't seem to be hitting the mark. What are they suggesting as alternatives?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. One of the ideas they bring up is this idea of shifting the focus. Instead of just getting people any job, how about finding the right job for each person?
Right, so it's not just about pushing people to work, it's about finding work that fits their skills and their limitations.
Exactly. And that means we need a better way to figure out what people are capable of doing. Instead of just saying someone is fit for work or not fit for work, we need to realize that there's a whole range of abilities. I mean, somebody might not be able to handle a really physical job, but they might be amazing at something that needs really strong analytical skills.
Makes sense. It's like we're finally acknowledging that people are individuals, not just numbers on a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
But how do we make that happen? It sounds pretty complicated.
It definitely needs a multifaceted approach. The sources talk about how important it is to invest in things like vocational training programs and make sure they're tailored to each person's needs. They also say it's crucial to give people one-on-one support and guidance to help them navigate the job market so they can actually find a job that's a good fit.
It's like a much more holistic approach, isn't it? It's not just about the economics of unemployment, but also the social and psychological side of things.
Exactly. And that's where the carrot comes in. If we give people the right kind of support and training and resources, we can empower them to succeed instead of punishing them for not meeting these requirements that might not even make sense for their situation.
Yeah, that's a big difference from that stick-heavy approach of the reform. But is there any discussion about how to pay for all of this?
Yeah, that's a big question. And one of the sources suggests looking into something called a basic income, a guaranteed minimum income for everyone, whether they're working or not.
Yeah, I've heard that idea floating around a lot lately. What are some of the pros and cons they bring up?
Well, the source that mentions it, they say it could really simplify things and to make sure everyone has at least a basic safety net. They say it could also save money on all the administrative costs. And it could give people the freedom to pursue education or start their own businesses, things they might not be able to do if they're always worried about losing their benefits.
Yeah, that makes sense. It could make the system a lot more flexible and adaptable. I mean, work isn't always a straight line for everybody.
You got it. But they do mention some potential downsides, too, like how much it would cost and the risk that some people might choose not to work if they're getting a basic income. It's a complex issue, and there are definitely trade-offs to consider.
It seems like every solution comes with its own set of problems. So is there any agreement among our sources about the best way forward?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that we need a more collaborative approach. The government can't fix this alone. It's going to take a partnership between the government and businesses and all these civil society organizations.
So we need to break down those silos and build a more integrated system.
Exactly. They're imagining a system where businesses are actively involved in training people and creating jobs, especially jobs designed for people with different abilities and backgrounds. And civil society groups would be there to provide support and guidance and create a sense of community for people who need it.
That's a pretty inspiring vision. It sounds like a society that actually cares about its people, but it also feels like a huge change from where Finland is now.
Oh, it definitely is. But the sources say it's not only necessary, it's possible. They say we need to fundamentally change the way we think about all of this. We need to stop this simplistic idea that people are either deserving or undeserving and start to understand the complex realities of unemployment and poverty.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. We started with this image of a broken system, and now we're talking about these hopeful visions of a more just and equal society. So as we wrap up this exploration of Finland's social safety net, what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, it feels like we've zoomed out a bit, haven't we? We started with Finland, but we're really talking about this global question of what do we owe each other as human beings?
It's true. I love that about these deep dives. We start with something specific, but we always end up in these big philosophical discussions. So no easy answers from our sources, but they gave us some good food for thought. What are some of those key takeaways that you think are worth chewing on?
I think the biggest one for me is that we have to stop looking for simple solutions. It's easy to fall into this trap of thinking about social safety nets in black and white terms. People are either deserving or they're not. They're hardworking or they're lazy. But our sources are saying it's way more complicated than that.
Yeah, like that thing we talked about earlier, how the system kind of encourages people to stay on benefits even if they could work. It's not as simple as saying those people are just choosing benefits over a job.
Right. There's usually a whole web of factors involved. That's why the sources emphasize how important it is to really understand each person's situation and all the obstacles they might be facing. They're pushing for a more holistic approach, one that looks at not just someone's ability to work, but also their access to education and transportation and childcare and all of those things.
It's about recognizing that work isn't just about earning a paycheck, right? It's about being able to contribute to society, feeling valued, having a sense of purpose.
Absolutely. And when we deny people those opportunities, whether it's intentional or not, we all end up worse off. One of the sources even says it's a moral obligation. We have to make sure that everyone has a chance to thrive.
I love that. It really makes you think about what kind of world we want to live in, one that punishes people or one that gives them a real chance.
Yeah, and that brings us to solutions. The sources say there's no magic wand we can wave, but they do offer some concrete ideas. One of the most interesting ones is rethinking how we assess someone's ability to work.
Right, we talked about moving away from that fit for work or not fit for work system and acknowledging that there are so many different levels of ability, but how do we actually put that into practice?
Well, it would take a lot of work and a commitment to investing in the right resources. The sources suggest developing better assessment tools, ones that consider things like cognitive skills and social skills and mental health. And they say we need to provide ongoing support and training to help people develop those skills and find work that really suits them.
So it's not just about figuring out if someone can work, it's about helping them find a job that's meaningful to them, recognizing that everyone has something to offer.
Exactly. And this ties into another big takeaway.
Collaboration.
They say we need the government and businesses and civil society all working together to make this happen.
So we've talked about the government's role. What about businesses? Where do they fit in?
Well, the sources imagine a system where businesses are more proactive. They're offering training and apprenticeships and even creating jobs that are specifically designed for people with different abilities. It's about going beyond just filling a position and being more socially responsible.
And what about those civil society groups?
They're super important for providing support and guidance to people who need it. They can connect people with resources and build communities and help people advocate for themselves.
It's amazing to think about how much potential There is. It's like a whole new way of thinking about social welfare. Not about dependency, but about empowerment and opportunity. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm wondering, what can our listeners do with all of this information? How can they apply it in their own lives and communities?
That's the question, isn't it? I think it all comes down to taking action. We might not have all the answers, but we can still make a difference by talking about these issues, challenging our own biases, and supporting policies that promote fairness. We can volunteer with organizations that are working to make things better. And we can use our voices to speak up for people who are often overlooked.
So it's not about waiting for someone else to fix the system. It's about each of us doing our part to create the kind of world we want to live in.
Exactly. Whether it's volunteering or contacting your representatives or just talking to your friends and family about this stuff, every little bit helps.
Well said. That's a great note to end on. As we wrap up this deep dive into Finland's social safety net, we hope you learned something new and maybe even feel inspired to make a difference. The challenges are real, but there's always hope. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep pushing for change. Until next time.